Welcome back. We're going to kick off segment 2 of chapter 6, and we're just going to talk about the relationship between price levels and inflation. And I think what we will do, just to start off and kind of get things out in the open, just define some terms about inflation. So basically, inflation is an increase in the average price levels. So it's a positive rate of change. And bear in mind, you're talking about the average price levels across the economy. Each market has its own price levels. So the price of beef may be going up, the price of gasoline may be going up, the price of automobiles may be going up. But just because you've got increasing prices in some market economies doesn't necessarily mean that it's across the board an increase in price levels, because you're talking about an average increase in price levels of everything that's either produced or consumed in the economy. And so that's kind of the differentiator between some spot prices of different commodities going up and an overall increase of average price levels that drives inflation. And as inflation is an increase in average price levels, deflation is a decrease in average price levels. And basically, it means a negative rate of change in price levels. A couple of other things to kind of kick off is, and you'll see in some later chapters, with respect to inflation, you can have something that the authors or economists just in general refer to as demand pull inflation. And there's also cost push inflation. I'm not going to get into much detail with that because you pick that up. It's either in chapter 7 or chapter 8. I don't remember which chapter it is, but we'll talk about it in a little more detail there. I just want to get the concept out to you. Then there's another concept where you're talking about inflation, and it's called hyperinflation. Hyperinflation, basically, it's very high and ever escalating inflation rates. And we typically think of hyperinflation, at least here in the United States, typically think about it occurred in either Central America, South American countries. Venezuela's had it in the past or still having it. Argentina, Brazil. So a lot of your South American countries have gone through this hyperinflation, and it's a difficult animal to kind of get your arms around. But again, it's something that we'll talk about in one of the later chapters. And also, there's a dynamic called stagflation. And that's basically also referred to as recession inflation. And what happens is the inflation rate is high, or it's increasing. Economic growth slows down, and unemployment remains steadily high. And it's basically a combination of inflation, stagnant growth, and that's where the term stagflation comes from. So it's inflation and economic stagflation. And for those of you, and maybe most people on this call aren't young enough to remember the 70s and 80s, but Volckers was chairman of the Fed, and I think Carter was president, and it was a real mess because it was a dilemma for policymakers. You know, policies were trying to control inflation, trying to bring it down. It was exacerbating, unemployment. Economy was starting to slow down. The Fed was trying to bump interest rates. Interest rates in the late 70s, early 80s got up to like 21% or so. But the economy in the United States was a mess at that time. Fortunately, we got out of it. But again, we've had issues with stagflation. That's probably the most recent issue with stagflation, and it lasted for several years. And I can remember going through that, still working. I was raised on a farm, so still working on the farm, hadn't gone back to graduate school at that time. And just the fact of trying to ensure that you had operating capital. And when I'm talking about capital, I'm talking about dollars. So the cost of borrowing money, the cost of a dollar, the cost of borrowing money at that time was just out of control at 21%. So really difficult on everybody concerned. I think at that same time, there was an oil embargo. The economy was just a mess at that time. As I said earlier, price level is the average level in prices in the economy. Rising prices or inflation, falling prices or deflation. The government has some macroeconomic type policy decisions to make. They can use monetary policy, fiscal policy, supply side policies, in some rhyme or reason, some pecking order. But again, we go back to information, data points, how accurate it is, because that's going to drive the unpredictability of the macroeconomic policies that any government can implement. And it provides a certain level of risk. Do you let the economy plug along and right itself or work through all these issues, or do you develop and enact a policy that actually makes the economy worse or makes a segment of the economy worse? If you think about the inflation rates, some numbers I pulled off the internet, it was 1.4% in 2020, 7% in 21, 6.5% in 22. So far in 23, it's plugging along at about 4%. And if you are paying attention to the financial markets and again listening to the talking heads, the Fed were bumping interest rates, trying to control inflation. So, and most countries try to manage inflation, deflation, stagflation, hyperinflation using the central bank, because the central bank controls money supply. In the United States, it's a Federal Reserve, and they try to manage these issues. And if you go back to that stagflation example that I provided, Jimmy Carter, who had to be president at the time, has the highest inflation rate and the third highest unemployment rate of any president in the history of the United States. So again, the economy was in really bad shape at that time. And so what policymakers like to do is they like to have a metric to help them manage inflation, to kind of measure inflation. And what we've come up with is the Consumer Price Index. And it's a single number whose movement reflects movements in the average level of prices. And again, it's the overall average level of prices in an economy. It's just not a single market or a couple of single markets. It's the overall average level of prices. And the Consumer Price Index, it tries to compare the average productivity within an economy. And the way it does it is it sets a base rate, and the base rate is set at 1982 to 1984, and that base rate is set at 100 points. So, and if you look at and kind of follow the CPI, I think the CPI for 2023 is plugging along at about 304, 305, and we'll get into that a little later, but gives you an idea of how much things have changed in potential percentage increases since the 82-84 base year of the CPI. And what you do with the CPI, and they go through step by step in the textbook, and if you're interested and want to create your own basket, metric that you might think is better capable of identifying issues or identifying inflation and the price level, you basically create a market basket. You take some goods and services that you think make sense, you make your market basket. In the book, they may have had pizza and beer and movie tickets, and I think everything was based around going to the movies, but and then you determine the cost in the base year, whatever you set that base year as. Maybe your base year is 2000, 2010, 2020, probably not a good base year because of COVID. But you pick a base year, you set the cost in the base year, you determine the cost in the current year, and then you compute your price index. And basically, your price index is the cost of the current market basket divided by the base year cost of the market basket. Multiply it by 100 if you want to drive that thing. And then really you want to look at the percentage change. It's not just the market baskets. So you take the new value of your market basket minus the old value of your market basket divided by the old value of the market basket, and you multiply it by 100. So if you're looking at the market basket in 2023 and you want to compare it to 2022, if you're looking at rate of change or percent change, you would take the value of 2023 minus your market basket in 2022 divided by 2022, multiplied by 100. And basically what happens is you're looking at the change in value from 23 to 22 divided by the old value, which in our case is 2022, multiplied by 100. And we will get into it a little deeper in some of these other chapters or some of the other components to chapter 6, but there's CPI, there's CPE, there's implicit price deflators, and we'll get into all those when we move forward. But again, if you wanted to compare 2023 to 2022, just looking at the consumer price index of the CPI, and you want to look at the rate of change, the CPI for 2023 is approximately 305. For 2022 was approximately 292. So 305 minus 292 divided by 292 times 100 gets you to 5%. So the rate of change in the consumer price index from 22 to 23 is 5%. So, and at least that's an estimate of 2023. So when you're talking about the CPI, or you hear Fox News or Fox Business News talking about CPI or CNN or any of your talking heads on TV that think they're experts, always remember when they're talking about, the CPI, that's what they're talking about. The CPI that's calculated in that way. And mostly when they're talking about it, they're concerned with rate of change. What's the change, time period to time period? They may be looking at, in April of 2023, they may be comparing that to April of 2022. And that rate of change, it's calculated, and that's the rate of change. That's the inflation numbers that they're throwing out on TV. That kind of wraps us up. We're going to get into CPI, CPE, implicit price deflator, and some other segments, but that's kind of given us a base to work with, some definitions of types of inflation, deflation, how a market basket is calculated, if you ever want to do one on your own, or you can just use the CPI because that seems to be one that is most readily available in the market. It's one that you will see contracts pegged to. You see it especially in healthcare, where the health plan's negotiating with the provider, and they have what they consider evergreen contracts, and those contracts don't expire. They just renew year after year, unless somebody decides, either one party or the other decides to terminate them. But what happens embedded in those contracts, and usually they're like 2, 3, 4 year contracts, each year there is a price inflator or a change to the prices, and a lot of times it's based on the consumer price index. And so that's why it's important that your salary that you negotiate, either at your current job, or maybe it's you're a student that's never been out in the workforce, and you get out in the workforce and you secure that first job, they may have your contract negotiated, or your employment contract negotiated in some way that you get an annual COLA, cost of living adjustment, so to whatever terminology you want to use. But a lot of times it's going to be tied, either set to a certain percentage. And in the past, a lot of those contracts have been set to low, like 1, 1.5%, 2%, because that's what the inflation rate has been. And as long as your salary was keeping pace with the inflation rate or above the inflation rate, you're okay. But if you negotiated a contract in 2020 and they pegged it to like 1.5% was the CPI, and then all of a sudden inflation is going 7%, then 6.5%, and then 4%, you're not keeping up with inflation, and it's going to be detrimental to your disposable income and really detrimental to the real disposable income that you have to spend in the market and buy goods and services for you or your family. So that's how all of this ties together, and we'll see as we go forward how it all ties together. So that's going to wrap it up for segment 2. We'll jump into segment 3 in a few minutes, and I'll see everybody back. Thank you.